Okay, so we are going to be looking at preparing for an AQA exam practice question. And the question is going to be focusing on to what extent is Macbeth a hero? Now, in order to look at this question thoroughly, we're going to be looking at the concept of the tragic hero, something that is prevalent throughout many of Shakespeare's plays. And in fact, you may know, I would imagine that many of his plays were categorized into what we refer to as tragedies, often containing what we refer to as a tragic hero. However, it is not quite as simple as just labeling Macbeth a tragic hero. We need to justify that, and we need to look at the reasons why he may or may not be a tragic hero, either tragic or heroic. So, to what extent is Macbeth a tragic hero? We're going to take a closer look at the contextual background of the tragic hero and to what extent this applies to Macbeth. So, Macbeth, tragic hero. Just a few little questions to try and get your brains going. And I would probably recommend maybe around 5 minutes or so to consider these questions and think of some responses and just jot your ideas down on a notepad or whatever it is you're using to write your ideas down on. You don't have to write your ideas down either, just as long as you think about these questions and think about how they might apply to our exam question. So first and foremost, what makes Macbeth a tragic hero? Secondly, to what extent is Macbeth heroic? Now, when considering that question, we do need to think about the context of the time period. So we do need to think about Elizabethan attitudes towards heroism. What would they consider heroic behavior? To consider heroic behavior, we also need to consider masculine behavior. So to what extent is Macbeth heroic? In what ways does he fall into the categories of Elizabethan ideas around heroism? And is Macbeth heroic even in his downfall? So even when he is well on his way to sort of killing everybody and destroying everything around him and descending into madness, could we possibly, looking at this through the eyes of Elizabethan and ourselves, consider any of his actions to continue to be heroic, despite the fact he's doing some pretty horrific things? So please have a little think about those three questions and then jot your ideas down. They're certainly going to help you respond to the exam question that we have later. Okay, so to further put the character of Macbeth into context, we're going to look at the sort of archetype that he plays. The tragic hero is an archetype that sort of has existed throughout literature, dating right back, as far as I know, probably further, but certainly back to sort of Greek mythology and fables, where the idea originated. And we have them in many modern day adaptations and films. So if we have a look at the screen in front of you, you can see sort of several famous heroes slash villains, sort of a mixture of both, in modern cinema and TV. So you may or may not know who some of these are. I've tried to pick a nice variation, hoping you'll know at least one or two of them. Two of them are in fact the same person, Anakin Skywalker, and later who he becomes, which is Darth Vader. Sorry for any spoilers that I may have given away there, but I'm sure if you guys have watched Star Wars, you'll know that anyway. Anyway, I digress. So have a think about what characteristics these characters may in fact share between them. What is it that actually separates them? So how are these people different? How are their motivations different? How are their acts of heroism different? How are their flaws different? That's really important to consider. What drives and motivates each of these characters? So often with a tragic hero, you'll find it's the thing that sort of motivates them the most that actually inevitably ends up being their downfall, or certainly their tragic flaw. And on the whole, do you consider these characters to be good or bad? Or can you consider them to be neither? Again, that's a really important question to consider when we're looking at the concept or idea of the tragic hero. So I'd probably give yourself around 5-10 minutes to think about those different questions in relation to each of these characters. And then we're going to have a little bit of feedback. Okay, so hopefully you thought of a few ideas for each of these people, but we're going to go through a couple of them not all, but we're certainly going to go for a couple and think about how they may be tragic heroes. So we're probably going to start with my favourite, massive Star Wars fan, for anyone that knows me. And we've got the character of Anakin Skywalker slash Darth Vader. So what is it that drives and motivates Anakin Skywalker? So it's to be the greatest Jedi warrior to have existed, or more specifically, the most powerful. Unfortunately, along his journey, it's that quest for power that ultimately sort of leads him to the dark side. His motivation for turning into ultimately Darth Vader is to protect his pregnant partner. And he is promised by sort of an evil character, the Emperor, that if he submits to the dark side, he'll have unlimited power and then be able to save his children, who he believes through some sort of premonition and fate, which is interesting because that links to Macbeth. He believes that his children are going to die based on a vision that he's had on his partner might die. So it's based on quite a noble idea or ambition, that he chooses to go to the dark side. But this is actually what ultimately causes the tragic flaw and ends in tragedy for Anakin Skywalker, with his partner dying and him becoming severely mutilated and committing horrific acts, and sort of him thinking to himself he can't turn back from this. Now, obviously, ultimately, gets towards the end of that story arc in Star Wars, and actually, I won't give it away, but there's a few surprises there on his trajectory, but generally, that is his tragic flaw. If we go on to the character of Snape, someone that, if you're not a Star Wars fan, you may well be a Harry Potter fan. So Snape is a really, really interesting character. Someone who's seemingly quite evil throughout much of the Harry Potter series. But ultimately, we sort of discover that he is not evil, and actually, there's quite a bit of good in him. But it's that goodness that does ultimately lead to his downfall as well. So Severus Snape, as a member of Slytherin, is technically supposed to be aligned with the evil Lord Voldemort, and certainly it seems he's a follower of Lord Voldemort as sort of the books progress. But there is a motivator. You might deem it a flaw, but you could argue it's a very good thing that leads to his demise. But he is actually pledged to protect the main protagonist, Harry Potter. And this is actually what ultimately leads to his downfall. So you could argue with Snape is a very complex character. That is his tragic flaw that he's a member of Slytherin, or is his tragic flaw that he pledges to protect Harry Potter because he fell in love with his mother? It's a really interesting character to look at, very complex. So all of these characters, tragic heroes, are generally very, very complex and hard to understand. And we generally have a mixture of feelings towards them. We have equal parts, maybe anger, frustration, but also perhaps admiration and empathy towards their situation. Now, I'm not going to go through the other characters. We've got Wolverine and Ned Stark from Game of Thrones there, but certainly, as a lover of literature, I'd recommend checking out those story arcs in those films, comic books, books, etc. Because I think tragic heroes are always the most interesting when we follow their story arcs. Anyway, we'll move on. Hopefully, that has given you some good understanding before we look at the character of Macbeth and how he's not just an easy one-dimensional character to analyze or understand. So, to get a bit more context and understanding behind the idea of a tragic hero, we go right back to the philosopher Aristotle, and this was his idea behind what makes up or comprises a tragic hero. So there are actually 5 things. There's just a little mistake here, but we'll ignore that. First and foremost, they will have a flaw or error of judgment, and this is referred to as hamartia. Okay, that's the technical terminology we would use. Note the role of justice and/or revenge in the judgments. So justice and revenge often play a role in their judgment, the character's judgment. 2, a reversal of fortune, peripeteia, brought about because of the hero's error in judgment. So these two are connected. 3, the discovery or recognition that the reversal was brought about by the hero's own actions. So often the tragic hero will ultimately realize it's in fact his own actions that have led him to the point he's in, which is normally some sort of demise. 4, excessive pride. So having far too much pride. Certainly the characters we just looked at, I think that is most certainly a part of all of those characters. Anakin Skywalker, definitely far too much pride. Severus Snape, his pride often gets in the way of him making the right decision at the right time. And we see that with Macbeth as well. Lady Macbeth constantly questioning his pride, and that's actually ultimately, you could argue, what leads him to make some of the horrific decisions that he makes. And lastly, the character's fate must be greater than deserved. Now, this is a very interesting one when we think about the character of Macbeth. So, is Macbeth's sort of justice or his fate, is it greater than what he deserved? Many would argue not, and therefore you might argue that he's not actually a fully tragic hero. Certainly, there are some elements of tragedy to his character, and there are certainly some heroic elements, particularly at the start. Anyway, that's why we've got him as a question. That's why we're going to look into him. There is no clear answer. And lastly, just some other traits that the character might have, the tragic hero. And it'd be interesting as a little task for you to just sort of see which of these would apply to Macbeth and which of these wouldn't. So if you want to have a go at that, probably pause the video now and have a little go at seeing which of these would actually apply to Macbeth and which of these indeed wouldn't. So just to run through them, the hero must suffer more than he deserves. The hero must be doomed from the start, but bears no responsibility for possessing his flaw. Hero must be noble in nature, but imperfect, so that the audience can see themselves in him. The hero's story should arouse fear and empathy. Hero must understand his doom, as well as the fact his fate was discovered by his own actions. The hero must have discovered his fate by his own actions, not by things happening to him. The hero must be physically or spiritually wounded by his experiences, often resulting in his death. The hero must be intelligent, so he may learn from his mistakes. The hero must have a weakness, usually it is pride. He has to be faced with a very serious decision that he has to make. Okay, so if you had a little go at that task, it's really interesting to see which ones you believe apply to Macbeth and which don't. I believe there's actually many that don't apply to him, and therefore he does not fit the traditional role of the tragic hero. That's just my point of view. You may beg to differ. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the exam question that we will be looking at this week. If you're going to do this as an assessment in my class, if you just happen to be watching this video, this would just be a good exam question to have a go at. So here's our question. Read the following question from Act 5, Scene 3 of Macbeth, and then answer the question that follows. At this point in the play, Macbeth is under siege from the English army. Here's our extract. Macbeth. Bring me no more reports. Let them fly all, till Burnham Wood removed Dunsinane I cannot taint with fear. What's the boy Malcolm? Was he not born of woman? The spirits that know all mortal consequences have pronounced me thus. Fear not, Macbeth. No man that's born of woman shall ever power upon thee. Then fly, false fanes, and mingle with the English epicures. The mind I sway by and the heart I bear shall never sag with doubt, nor shake with fear. Enter a servant. The devil damn thee black, thou cream-faced loon. Where gottest thou that goose look? Starting with this speech, explain how far you think Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a hero. Write about how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in this speech, and secondly, how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in the play as a whole. So, first and foremost, it's just really important to clarify what you must ensure you do for this particular question, and that is to look at these bullet points here. You must ensure that we are analysing quotations and ideas and structure from this particular extract, but then also referring to many other examples throughout the play. And that's probably, some may argue, the hardest aspect of the exam, but I look at it as actually an advantage. It gives you an opportunity to use the quotations that you know and you like even to help argue your case and point. Just ensure that the quotations you choose are applicable to the question itself. But that is where you get a real opportunity to shine, because that's stuff that you would have revised and you'll know, and it should be of benefit to you to use those examples, not just the ones from this extract. Obviously, if you're struggling and you happen to find it very difficult, then of course stick with the extract and try to refer to the text elsewhere in your response. But I'd recommend using that to your advantage. Okay, moving on. I'm going to give you a bit of support and help here by looking at that second bullet point. So using quotations from elsewhere in the text. Now, you can absolutely use quotations from anywhere in this play, and it's not just quotations. You might refer to certain actions and moments, but certainly we get the bulk of our marks and recognition from actually analysing the language itself. So here are some quotations that I think could be good for this, but there are many, many other that you may choose to use. So these two quotations here are from early on in the play. I'm just going to read them out for you. A brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like Valor's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave. I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. Okay, two very good quotations you could choose to analyse there, that perhaps show heroic traits and ideology within Macbeth. And it's interesting how he's certainly heroic at the start of this play, and gradually, as his flaws take over and he succumbs to them, he becomes less and less and less, I'd argue even not heroic at all, as the play goes on. But it depends how you would define heroic, and that's one of the interesting parts about this. So I am going to go into a bit of depth and detail later in this video, looking at these quotations to give you a few more ideas, but it's worth considering the overall ideology of the audience here when we look at this. So what would an Elizabethan audience, or even the people at the time this play was set, if we go back to the 1200s, what would they consider to be a heroic individual? Someone that's brave in battle, someone that's honourable, someone who's not going to break the great chain of being, which is to interfere with the pyramid structure with God at the top, then the king, and then everyone else. Is it somebody that's going to stand up and control his wife, which certainly I would imagine they would expect that. And that's interesting because you could argue he's not heroic in some ways at the start, because he's overpowered by his wife, and that certainly goes against what the audience would have expected. But he is sort of he's trying to justify his own ideology, which we would argue is heroic, which is to be honourable and noble, etc. So there's a real conflict. He's really conflicted at the start of this, and that's arguably what his tragic flaw is, Macbeth. Perhaps his tragic flaw is that he is trying to be a hero, he's trying to do the right thing, but he's torn between his wife and what society expects of him. Okay, a couple more quotations to consider. So, yet I do fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. So this is Lady Macbeth when she's referring to her husband, just talking about him. And she fears his nature, and she fears his nature in regards to his kindness. Now, surely that's a heroic thing. Surely that's a good thing, that he is kind. And yet here she is criticizing that. Now, you could also sort of defend that by arguing that, well, actually, a great warrior, a man's man, if you like, the hero, shouldn't be too kind. He should be ruthless. But in this example, it's his kindness that actually would prevent him from killing the king, which in itself would not be heroic. So once again, I'm trying to present to you that the idea of a hero itself is flawed during this time. And Macbeth is torn between what type of hero is he going to be? Is he going to be a hero for his wife, or a hero for his king and society? And lastly, let's consider what Macbeth's tragic flaws might be. So here's a good quotation to demonstrate this. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. Secondly, Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Okay, a couple of other good quotations there that sort of illustrate further flaws in Macbeth. The first one, the first quotation I just read aloud, probably one of the most memorable and a really good one for you guys to learn in preparation for your exam. But it clearly states what he believes his ambition, what his flaw is. And that was one of the things, the characteristics of the tragic heroes, that they are aware of their flaw. So he's saying here he's got no intent to kill his king except for one thing, and that's his ambition. His ambition, though, is not clarified. Is his ambition to be king, or is it his ambition to simply please his wife and be the ultimate hero and power to her? Interesting thing to think about and argue in your essay. Okay, before I get into analysing some quotations to try and assist you, I just thought I'd highlight a really fantastic worksheet that I found online, courtesy of the author Garbo to Garbo, and this is on tes.com. It's completely, as of the making of this video, free to download, but that does change depending on the author's permission, etc. So check that out. Really fantastic worksheet to use. Definitions down the left-hand side, meanings in the middle, and Macbeth as a tragic hero on the right, just to help you and give you a few further ideas. Okay, so I'm now going to go through and do a live annotation of some of the quotations that I picked out. And when I say live annotation, it means I haven't pre-annotated these quotations. I'm going to just do it as you guys would do this in an exam by thinking on the spot. So there may well be errors in this. It may not be as fluent as you might expect, but this is an accurate representation of what you guys are going to go through, as this is what I'm going through here and now. Obviously, I'm at the benefit that I've been teaching this for quite a long time, so I'm going to have ideas, and lucky enough that I've studied Shakespeare, so it's easier for me to pick out these things. But I'm just trying to be helpful and show you guys that it's perhaps not as hard as you might believe it to be. So let's look at the first quotation. For brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like Valor's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave. So the first thing is really obvious things for brave Macbeth. So the fact that he's labelled as brave before his actual name just highlights how significant this character thinks him to be. So if we go back to the question, to what extent is he a hero? We could certainly say the fact that he's referred to as brave Macbeth certainly just backs up this idea that he's heroic. Now, what makes someone who's brave heroic? Well, people in this time period certainly believed that if you were to be heroic, you would have to be brave and fearless of your enemy. That is the traditional idea of a hero. And then you could just say as well, furthermore, that this hyphen here and here, just to add this additional piece of information, well, he deserves that name, it just fully backs up that this has been earned, this title of brave, and that would not have just been thrown around willy-nilly, it wouldn't have just been given to anybody. Next line, disdaining fortune. So this is a fantastic quotation. Disdaining fortune. So almost laughing at the idea of luck. There is no luck as far as Macbeth is concerned. It just links the idea that he's so powerful, so heroic, that his fate is set before him. It's inevitable that he's going to win. Okay, luck does not play a part in the skill of Macbeth and his ability in battle. Next line, which smoked with bloody execution. So here we've got this sort of hyperbolic metaphorical imagery of his blade literally smoking with execution. Now, that conjures up an idea of him as a really brutal warrior, and he's killed many, many people to the point that, you know, his sword has heated up and he's actually steam arising from it. But there actually could be a really practical reason for the steam rising. It could be because it's cold and the blood itself is warm, and that is causing the steam to rise from his sword. But regardless, it creates a really violent image of Macbeth, but actually that would have made him heroic, somebody in the battle, ruthlessly killing his enemies, or his king. That would have been deemed heroic, although we could argue actually that is not heroic to an extent because actually he's slaughtering people mercilessly. And then, like Valor's minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave. And then I think the last thing we could probably talk about there is Valor's minion. So he's the slave of bravery. Okay, Valor being bravery. So he's doing bravery's dirty work, if you like, and that's just a really great way to summarize somebody being heroic, if you like. You know, he is the epitome, the personification of bravery. Okay, we're going to skip this one and we're just going to go to this one down here. So, yet I do fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness. So here we've got Lady Macbeth fearing her husband's nature. She fears the fact that he is kind. Is that because, in her eyes, a man should not be kind? Is her idea of a hero different to what society's is? For Lady Macbeth, her hero is the man she thinks does not show kindness, is ruthless, makes decisions. And at the start of the play, that is not the case. She's the one who controls him. She's the one who makes the decisions for him. And perhaps that's why she's so aggravated by him and says things like this. We could also further pick this apart and says full of the milk. Now, milk, obviously, being something that a female produces. So perhaps she's almost subtly inferring that he's actually feminine here, which would go against the idea of your traditional hero. Okay, you want your hero, to show masculine qualities. And she's almost inferring that he's perhaps feminine in the way he thinks. Interesting how, if we look at the stereotypes, gender stereotypes at this time period, you may expect women to be kinder than men. Certainly, men who have aspirations of being a king were expected to be ruthless, which Macbeth, in some ways, is not when it comes to making the decision to kill his king, which may, you argue, end up being his fatal flaw. Okay, that's enough in terms of elsewhere. You can analyze your own quotations and you may choose to look some up as well. We're going to go to the question now. So what is heroic, or arguably not heroic? Because when we get a question of how far you think he is presented as a hero, we can argue that he's not presented as a hero as well. So let's have a look at this and see if there's any examples either way. Bring me no more reports, let them fly. Oh, now you may argue that his very sort of commanding tone, which is completely at odds with his more subservient tone to his wife at the start of the play, definitely shows someone who is perhaps being heroic. He's being decisive, he's making decisions. So you may argue that is indeed heroic. And indeed, the bravery that he's showing, I cannot taint with fear. So we've got these sort of imperatives, these definitive words, I cannot. He's almost completely filled with pure confidence or even arrogance, which you may argue again could be heroic. On the other hand, you may argue it's not heroic. You may argue it is, in fact, perhaps naivety, or, like I said before, even arrogance or stupidity. And this is ultimately what is going to lead to his downfall. And that goes against the idea of the tragic hero, because the tragic hero is supposed to recognize what makes him flawed, whereas almost seemingly here, Macbeth doesn't. He's fully bought into the idea that he is invincible. And that's just further backed up when he cites the witches here. Fear not, Macbeth, no man that's born of woman shall ever have power upon thee. And the fact he's quoting this prophecy shows that he clearly believes it. So perhaps you could argue he's got a false sense of heroism being built up within him in this particular extract. I'm going to stop there. You hopefully will perhaps find a lot more than I've gone through. So I've just given you a few ideas that would be of benefit to you for your exam. So obviously, when it comes to the exam itself, looking at this question now, for the AQA exam, you get approximately an hour to answer this question. So I'd probably recommend around 30 minutes on each half, meaning this bullet point, apologies, meaning this bullet point down here and top bullet point Don't know why that's not letting me change that. That's annoying. Okay, so the first bullet point here, how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in his speech, and the second bullet point, how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in the play as a whole, half an hour on each. And I'm not going to say do this many paragraphs for this bullet point, etc. You should just aim to write as much as you can possibly write about each quotation that you look at. So it's really important. I generally use what I call a PEDCA structure. So that's point, evidence, explain, develop, context, and audience. And the develop, context, and audience for me is the most important part of the paragraph. The development is where you've got opportunities to dig deeper into the quotation, give alternative ideas and options, and link in other ideas perhaps. And then we link to the context. So we might just link to, as I've said before when I was explaining this video, Elizabethan ideology around heroism, or even go back to Aristotle's idea of the tragic hero and how he may or may not match up with that. And then also linking it to author's intention. So what was Shakespeare's ultimate intention? What was his moralistic story, perhaps, or idea for us to take on board? Anyway, I'm going to stop the video there. Hopefully that's going to give you a really good foundation upon which to attempt this particular exam. As before, please leave any constructive feedback in the videos and just let me know what you found helpful or didn't and what you'd like to see in any future videos. Thank you for watching.